verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book, the power of God seen in the pages of Scripture through the Bible. Most Bibles only list 3 missionary journeys for Paul through the book of Acts, but I'm of the opinion chapters 27 and 28 document his 4th missionary journey. Paul was the one who appealed to Rome, so even though he's going as a prisoner, he has significant influence throughout the journey. The centurion guarding him shows increasing deference to Paul as the journey extends. I'd love to interview this man. I strongly suspect we'll meet him one day in heaven. In this journey to Rome, there's no doubt Paul engaged in powerful gospel witnessing exactly as he did in the 3 earlier journeys. Acts 27:1. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So, entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us, and the next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Don't overlook that Luke records in this account, we should sail to Italy. Luke, along with Aristarchus, also voluntarily went on this missionary journey as aides to Paul, but also as witnesses for Paul's trial. From 2 Timothy 4:20, some have said Trophimus also accompanied them, but was left in Miletus due to sickness. The first-hand account of this journey is expertly recorded by Luke, with very specific and exacting details documented. Also, notice the immediate inclination of Julius, the centurion, towards Paul. He treated him kindly and gave him liberty to be cared for by friends. I think the preaching of Paul in Acts 26 before Agrippa had impacted Julius greatly. Julius seems to go out of his way to show respect for Paul. Now when he had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. This account includes some of the rarest and most detailed historical maritime records from the ancient Mediterranean world, giving insights into a shipping captain's difficult life and death decision-making. These were indeed dangerous waters, with many hazards to be avoided. It's clear they're sailing into deeper and deeper trouble, facing tougher and tougher sailing conditions. Verse 9. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, this fast referenced is talking about the Day of Atonement, telling us it's likely early October, meaning autumn was upon them, with winter just around the corner. Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbour was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbour of Crete, opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. The centurion respected Paul, but he understandably assumed the ship owner and helmsman had greater maritime knowledge. Paul isn't given prophetic utterance with this advice. He's just giving his perceptions. We're headed into dangerous waters and a really bad time of year. The ship owner and helmsman absolutely understood this, but feel as if they have no other good choice, as Fairhaven's harbour was considered not suitable for a long winter stay. It offered no protection at all from southerly or southeastern winds and storms. If they sailed west 40 miles and stayed near to shore, they'd make it to the safer harbour of Phoenix. Verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called the Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. Their plans to creep around the southern coastline of Crete to the port of Phoenix, less than a day's sailing away, quickly came unstuck as the Euroclydon tempest came upon them from the northwest. You know, when they give a storm a name, you're dealing with something deadly. They were left to the mercy of the sea storm and were quickly driven to deeper water south, where they stumbled across the island of Clauda, giving them a small window of chance to secure their skiff or lifeboat to their larger vessel in very difficult circumstances. In case you haven't fully realised their situation, the sailors were in a fierce battle to save their lives. Verse 17. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we, notice the we, everyone now is involved, threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. People have debated the meaning of some of these technical details. Suffice it to say, the experienced sailors were using every trick they knew to keep themselves and their passengers alive. Cables to hold the hull together, probably storm anchors cast into the water to slow their progress down. The taking on board in verse 17 relates to the lifeboat trailing behind their ship. In Luke's now familiar fashion, he records, "No small tempest beat on us." In other words, the mother of all storms drained them of all hope of survival. Many days driven by a wild storm, without sight of sun or stars, no clue where they were. A collection of sailors and travellers, now without hope, exactly where God wanted them. Once we give up our earthly strugglings, humans will finally be willing to hand things over to God. Verse 21. Now after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete, and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as he told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island.' It's only at the point of hopelessness now are the crew and passengers willing to fully comply with the instructions of Paul. Once people give up hope, they will quickly surrender their lives. But the moment they hear the confidence of Paul and the plans of God, they have a new hope to cling to, a new courage to drive them forward to survive another day. Their eyes all filled with panic and defeat. But now standing before them is Paul, this famed prophet of the Hebrew God. No panic in his voice, no fear in his eyes. Paul speaks with God-given confidence, and Paul's hope spreads to the passengers and crew. God predetermined it. The angel revealed it. Paul spoke it. The passengers heard it, and God would deliver on it. Verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings, and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again, and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest they should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, and prayed for day to come. 2 incredible, horrifying weeks lost in the Adriatic Sea. Tossed and dragged in every direction, the ship on the verge of being torn apart. Imagine reefs ready to shred their ship at any moment. Now as they approach some unknown shore, 4 anchors just holding the ship from the clutches of jagged rocks. All on board prayed like they'd never prayed before for the breaking of dawn, and the hope that light might possibly bring. I suspect all prayed to Paul's God, the one true God, under the spiritual direction and leadership of prisoner number 1, Paul. Incredibly, after 2 weeks lost, subjected to the winds, storms, waves and currents, God had guided them to a certain beach, on a certain island, where a certain people were waiting to hear the gospel from Paul. Verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. There's no doubt the centurion and soldiers are now 100% under the command of Paul. They needed no further proof. Paul is a man who communes directly with a powerful God. Maybe by this point, some had even been born again and trusted 100% in the one true God. Regardless, whatever Paul commanded, they immediately now obey him. They'd listened to the advice of the sailors over Paul 2 weeks earlier. They would not make that mistake again. The fact the sailors were willing to abandon all their passengers reveals just how frightening a storm this was. We see in this passage a true leader rising when the terrible storms of life strike. Verse 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, Today is the 14th day you have waited, and continued without food, and eaten nothing. They'd all been too busy just clinging on, surviving. No one had time to even prepare a scrap of food to eat. Verse 34. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. Paul steals them. Take courage, eat some food. It'll give you the final burst of energy you'll need to struggle to shore. Verse 35. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and also took food themselves. And in all there were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Even in a deadly storm, their lives on the line, Paul doesn't forget to give thanks to God for this simple meal of bread, giving guidance to us the central importance of prayer. Always give thanks to God for your meals. Thank him in the good times and the bad. Every day, every hour is a good day, is a good hour to pray to our mighty God, to give thanks to him and offer him praise. Verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible, and then let go the anchors, and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made for shore. But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast, and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. Their plan quickly fell apart as the front or prow of the ship was stuck upon a reef, and the stern or rear of the ship was smashed by powerful and violent waves. The ship was quickly being torn apart as they remained stuck upon the reef. Verse 42, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. It's hard to overstate the sense of panic and chaos that came over the 276 souls on this ship. The soldiers, now finally believing they had a glimmer of hope for a future, start to fall back on their Roman training. Kill the prisoners, lest any escape. But the centurion by this point is a man greatly impacted by the preaching and teaching of Paul. Paul was a very impressive man. The centurion had never encountered a man quite like Paul. So the centurion protected Paul, prisoner number 1, and gave the command for the competent swimmers to swim first to shore. The soldiers would have been amongst this first group to depart, being first on the beach, enabling them to secure the prisoners as they also made it to shore. And exactly as was revealed to Paul the night before, all 276 souls miraculously escaped safely to land. Until our next study, may God richly bless you all.